I don't get invited to many fancy dinner parties, the kind where you really have to dress up and it's all white linen tablecloths and candles and more forks and spoons laid out than you know what to do with. And you're seated at an assigned place setting with your name engraved on a little card right in front of your plate. Fancy. When I've attended those kind of events, sometimes I've found myself not seated next to my date, Ellen, because she has been a much bigger deal than me. She was the producer and star of her own PBS TV show. She was the anchor of the nightly news, and she was on the city council. She won all kinds of awards and things like that. So she would sit up at the head table with all the other very important people, while I was placed in the far corner, about 50 yards away, where it was dark, next to the restroom and seated with the people who were alternates in case someone more significant than you could not attend. Our hot food was cold and our cold food was warm by the time it got served, but I didn't mind that really. I'm not the least bit resentful of being intentionally placed so far away from the people who really mattered, because me and the other nobodies in the peanut gallery would still have a good time making snarky comments. It had absolutely no impact on our self esteem. We would gratefully bask in the glow emanating from the host and those who had actually achieved something in life, apparently, or those who were born into wealth and fame and influence and worthiness. It was just good to be there. So I hold no grudges from those experiences. No, I see them as learning opportunities, lessons in humility. The truth is, being invited to a fancy dinner party in the first place is kind of cool. Regardless of where you're seated, it's fun and instructive to observe all the social dynamics at play. Now, something that jumped out at me, one of the first times I ever attended a dinner party like that, was how the party was kind of a microcosm of society as a whole. Whether we admit it or not, we tend to value different people differently. Based on their wealth, their status, achievement, fame, power, it's just a natural human inclination to do that. People have formed pecking orders ever since there have been people pecking. The only problem with placing a high value on someone is not that they're undeserving of our high esteem. They may be quite deserving of our attention and admiration. The problem is when we place a lesser value on anybody else because they lack things like wealth, status, achievement, power, or fame. Or worse, we place a lesser value on anyone because they simply don't fit our ideal of who we would invite to a dinner party because of, let's say, their age, gender, race, sexual orientation, or gender identity, their nationality or their religion or lack thereof, or their politics. It's important to admit that there might be some people out there who would not make it onto our personal guest list. But it's even more important to honestly ask ourselves, why not? Why wouldn't they make the cut? Or if they were included, where would we seat them? That's what Jesus was asking one time when he was invited to a fancy dinner party. When he observed how the host was seating all the guests, Jesus took the opportunity to offer what sounded like some solid social advice. He said, "Don't take a seat up near the front in case the host asks you to give up your place for somebody else. So just avoid that potential embarrassment. It's better to take a seat at the back. Then, if the host wants to move you closer to all the movers and the shakers, you'll be the object of everyone's admiration. Look at him. Isn't he special?" Good strategy. But as only Jesus can do, he takes what at first glance seems to be common sense advice and turns it in a direction no one expects. He says, "For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." And that was an amazing statement. Those folks already knew that the exalted can sometimes be humbled. After all, they had read the book of Job, where the guy with everything he wanted in life, great wealth, a big family, perfect health, friends who held him in high esteem, he lost it all and was reduced to living in a trash dump. And they knew that sometimes the humble can be exalted. They knew the Cinderella story from the book of Ruth, where the poor girl who devoted herself to caring for her mother-in-law meets a handsome prince and they live happily ever after. So they knew those stories, but Jesus was pushing the point a bit too far when he said all who are exalted and all who are humble. All is an awfully big word. In what universe are all people treated equally and with the same value? Sounds a bit naive at best, Jesus. And he went a bit far, well beyond the list of people you'd ever invite to a dinner party, when he said, when you give a banquet, invite the poor, invite the crippled, invite the lame, and invite the blind. But I mean, after all, didn't those people get what they deserved? They must have done something wrong, or they must have somehow been morally flawed to be in the shape that they're in. Why in the world would I invite them to my party? And even if I did, where on earth would I seat these people? Well, the answer Jesus gives to that why question is because you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. It's important to remember that Jesus was attending a dinner party at the home of a Pharisee. Now, Pharisees often show up in the Gospels as the antagonists of Jesus, but it's safe to say there's a reason for that, because they were the folks Jesus may have wanted to interact with most, really, to open their eyes to a new way of understanding who God is and how God operates in the world. Now, the Pharisees were good, solid, church-going people who believed, as Jesus did, in the concept of resurrection. Resurrection's the idea that we can be transformed from one way of being to another way, to awaken into a new way of living fully as citizens of God's kingdom. It's a transformation away from being dead to the world, out of that place where we were blinded by our assumptions and prejudices and fears and limitations, and then projecting all of that onto our beliefs about the nature of God, and allowing that to poison how we regard and treat others by ranking people on a scale of unworthy to worthy. To live in a resurrected way is to flip that entire script, knowing that our worthiness and belonging and love are already assured, that in God's kingdom there are no unworthies. Anytime we think about who should not be invited to our party, or who should be seated far away from everyone else in the corner, that's a sign that we're not living in a resurrected way, that we haven't fully awakened to the new life of seeing and regarding others as God sees and regards all people, as inherently valuable and beloved and worthy of the very best seat at the table. And we don't know if the Pharisees at that party accepted or rejected Jesus' idea, his radical vision of what God is really all about. They were the good, faithful, upright, church-going members of society, but his concepts did not quite jibe with what seemed to be the natural, normal way of things. That there's always going to be a pecking order, that there's always better seats for the right people, that there's always folks who are left off the invitation list altogether because they just don't quite measure up to our standards. That's just how things work in the real world, and they always have. Are we really going to change that? Again, I believe Jesus would have to have us ask the question, well, why not? And if not us, then who? What are we even here for, if not to be and do something different than the way the world works and always has? To make that happen, we first have to admit a few things about ourselves. Far too often in the Christian church, we operate exactly in the way our world works. We can turn our congregations even into exclusive clubs or academies for congratulating ourselves for holding the right beliefs. Aren't we so right? So, sticking to the correct doctrines or practices in worship becomes something that we can see as a perfectly normal prerequisite for belonging. We don't think of those things as excluding anybody. We have to have some standards, right? Otherwise, we might say, well, what's the point? What's the point if everyone's invited, if everyone belongs, if God already accepts and loves all people? The point is to celebrate that truth. The point is to be different from the way the world values and devalues people, how our culture includes and excludes people. The point is not to believe the right things, the point is to do the right thing. The point is to awaken to our own belonging and worth and throw out the seating chart to welcome all to the party that God is throwing for us. Our only job is to catch up with what God is already doing, and that is accepting and loving everyone exactly as they are.